In the previous video lesson, we analyzed general properties, the ins and outs of a bishop. We learned how to use your bishop to their full potential and how to strangle the opponent's bishops. Now we'll discuss how a bishop works with or against other pieces. We will start from one of the most common topics, the never-ending battle between a bishop against a knight. First of all, I'd like to say that a bishop is stronger than a knight. It's a common illusion that these pieces are equal. How do we know that one piece is stronger than another one? We put a piece in the center of the board and calculate how many squares it controls. This is how we know that a rook is stronger than a knight, for example. A bishop can control 13 squares maximally. A knight can control only 8 squares at most. "13 against 8. The verdict should be clear, right? Therefore, a bishop is stronger. By the way, a rook controls 14 squares. Thus we may conclude that a bishop's value is closer to a rook than to a knight. There are lots of facts that can prove that a bishop is stronger than a knight. Two bishops can mate opponent's single king easily, two knights can't do it at all. Next, two bishops are stronger than two knights in almost any position. A bishop can dominate against a knight. A knight cannot do that. A bishop can work at a long distance. It can play on both flanks simultaneously. For a knight it's impossible. A bishop is often more powerful than three pawns. The knight, on the other hand, struggles against a mass of pawns, especially when they are located on different sides of the board. I'd like you to remember it. A bishop is stronger than a knight. Trading opponent's bishop on your knight gives you a material advantage. All strong players know about it, but lots of club players don't. This gives you great chances to get a practical benefit from understanding this rule. Well, please don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that a bishop is much stronger. Of course not. A bishop is a bit stronger than a knight, but anyway, it's stronger. I know you will argue, hey, but in some positions a knight is stronger. In some specific positions a knight can be stronger than a queen, for example when you give a smothered mate. But does that mean that knight is stronger than a queen? Of course not. Here we're talking about most often cases, and in most ordinary positions a bishop is stronger. This is a well-known game, Nimzovich Capablanca, and maybe you know it. The position is quite standard. White has an extra passed pawn, which should determine White's huge advantage. However, Black has a bishop against a knight, and this makes the situation unclear. By the way, let's imagine the same position without the knight and bishop. Then White has a clearly winning position. White will simply push his passed pawn, while Black has nothing to oppose. Okay, let's go back to the game. The Black's bishop pressures the White's queen side. What the knight can do? Nothing really. Even if White transfers this knight somehow to d4 or f4, it still will not do much. In the game, Black played queen c4, rook d1. Now Black can take on c3 and then take back the a4 pawn. However, it will probably lead to a draw while Black wants more. Black doesn't want to trade his powerful bishop, and that's why he played rook b8, queen e3, rook b4. Now Black is threatening bishop d4. That's why White removed the queen. Bishop d4, king h1, rook b8. Black increases the pressure gradually. The White's knight is rather an object of an attack here. Now Black is threatening to take it after bishop takes c3. White gave up an exchange, rook takes d4, but certainly his position is losing after that. Here is another example. Who is better here? White obviously has a better pawn structure. He has a pawn center, while Black's kinside pawns are weak. However, Black has good compensation due to his bishop. As we know, a bishop against a knight gives a little material advantage. Let's see the game continuation. Bishop d7, castling, rook c8, queen e2, queen a5. Both players make quite natural moves. Bishop c6. Now we can clearly see a bishop's great advantage over a knight. The c6 bishop protects his queenside pawns and pressures the white center and castling. The f3 knight is pretty useless actually. It has no moves forward and is difficult to transfer it somewhere. White may try to bring the knight to c5, but Black will easily push it away playing b6. In the game, White played knight d2. Now I'd like to tell you another useful practical rule. A bishop becomes more powerful when it has no counterpart. In this case, opponent has nothing to oppose to this bishop. That's why it makes sense to play on that part of the board where your bishop looks. According to this rule, Black should attack on a king side here. He played king h8 and rook g8. Rook b3, now f5. A bishop needs open diagonals. Knight c4, queen d8, knight e5. Finally, White brought the knight to a good square, but it cost him a pawn after queen takes d4. There followed king f7, king g7. Now the a1 rook is attacked, so he played rook d1, queen takes e4. Black won a pawn and is still taking the white's king. In the game, White played rook g3 check, and White threw the towel after king takes f7. Thus, in most normal positions, a bishop is stronger than a knight. This advantage becomes even bigger in an endgame. This is another important practical rule. In the previous lesson, we analyzed that a bishop's power rises in an endgame. Here you can place your bishop in the center, attack opponent's pawns on both flanks, and so on. In contrast to a bishop, a knight's power goes down in an endgame. A knight needs strong squares where it can be placed on. When lots of material was traded, it's difficult to find such strong squares. Another disadvantage of a knight is that it cannot play on both flanks, something that's often essential in an endgame. The pawn structure is symmetric and the position looks drawish. However, White has a bishop, which determines his huge advantage. White played bishop f1, attacking the a pawn, a5, and bishop c4. Now we can see a great difference between minor pieces. The White's bishop attacks both flanks, while the knight is only a spectator. Moreover, there are no strong squares where the knight can be transferred. Thus a knight is doomed to be passive during the whole next game. There followed rook f8, king g2, then king f3, knight d7. Black is trying to find a job for his knight, so he transferred it to c6. But even after this transfer, the Black's knight is still passive. I will not show you the whole game because it's pretty long. White traded the rooks and brought his king to the queen side. Then the following position appeared. The White's bishop ties the knight down to the defense of the g6 pawn. Also, a bishop controls the c6 square, not allowing Black's king to go there. A bishop's ability to play on both flanks is really powerful in an endgame. Now Black is in Zugzwang, and after the only move king d8, White played bishop takes g6 and king takes b6. White is winning all Black's queenside pawns, and then he will simply push his passed pawns forward. White won this game soon. Let's make some conclusions. First, generally a bishop is stronger than a knight. This advantage is especially big when a position is opened and bishop has lots of open diagonals, or when a bishop can play on both flanks and in an endgame. In these types of positions, a bishop can show his full power. And the next rule. Often it makes sense to play on that part of the board where your bishop points to. Since your opponent has nothing to oppose, your attack will be very powerful. In some specific positions, a knight can be stronger than a bishop. This happens when a bishop's activity is restricted. In the previous lesson, we analyzed 4 ways to restrict a bishop. The first method is not applicable in the battle between bishops and knights. Thus we have 3 main cases where a knight can be stronger. I would like you to pay attention on the first 2 situations. They are the most common. First, a knight can be stronger when a bishop is blocked by a pawn chain. It can be your pawn chain or opponent's one. This usually happens in closed positions. Second, when you can fix your knight on a strong central square. A knight is a short-ranged piece and it must be delivered to a place of action. That's why it's crucial for a knight to have strong squares. Otherwise, the opponent will push it away and the knight will be out of game. Actually, this is what happened in all the games we analyzed in this lesson. Here, the black c6 pawn realizes a very important function. It takes away the d5 square from the white's knight. Thus the knight has no active squares to be placed on. A similar situation happened in this example. The f6 pawn doesn't allow white to place the knight to e5. Thus the knight has no available moves forward. Next, let's take a look at an opposite situation. Here, the black's bishop is restricted by a pawn chain, and the knight has a strong square in the center. Both conditions for a knight's advantage were complied. This is a classical situation when a knight is definitely stronger. In the game, white won pretty soon. Rook c5, knight e3, attacking the d6 pawn, bishop e7, b4, pushing the rook away, and rook b6. White is winning the b5 pawn, and then he will simply move his passed pawn towards promotion. Okay, let's make a final conclusion. Generally, a bishop is stronger than a knight. This advantage is especially big when the position is opened, when the bishop can play on both flanks, and when it's already the endgame. A knight, on the other hand, can be stronger in 2 major cases. First, when a bishop is blocked by a pawn chain, and secondly, when a knight can be placed on a strong central square. Okay, next we will talk about positions with opposite colored bishops. You already know all the general ideas about bishops. That's why everything will be simple for you here. A bishop is especially powerful when your opponent has no counterpart. In this case, it makes sense to play on that part of the board where your bishop points to. Your attack will be very powerful because your opponent has nothing to oppose to your bishop. Thus you will have an extra piece into the attack. That's why different colored bishops strengthen an attack. Since such an attack is often winning, the activity of the bishops becomes a key factor. A bishop's activity is determined by a pawn structure mainly. That's why a pawn structure becomes extremely important. This is the whole theory about opposite colored bishops. Everything becomes clear and simple when you have a good chess understanding. Take a look at the following example. What is the evaluation of this position? What do you think? Maybe it looks unclear to you. Let's use our theory about opposite-colored bishops, however. The key factor in such positions is the activity of bishops. That's what we should really think about. The white c3 bishop looks at the black's king side and white will attack there. Black may try to close the bishop's diagonal by playing e5. However, the e5 pawn will be weak and it will be under the pressure of the white's bishop anyway. We may conclude that white has good chances for an attack. The black's bishop is also on the long diagonal. However, white can block it easily by playing f3. After that, it's almost impossible for black to open a long diagonal again. Thus, black's chances for an attack are next to nothing. By the way, black is a pawn up. Does it compensate black his less active position? Definitely not. An activity of opposite-colored bishops is the most important factor in such positions. The one who can start an attack has good chances to mate the opponent's king. Of course, a pawn can't compensate it. Okay, let's look at the game's continuation. White played queen e3. White is double attack the black's pawns e7 and e6, and a7. What should black do now? Again, we should think about the activity of opposite-colored bishops first of all. Black could play e5 here, closing the white's bishop. After rook takes a7, white certainly has more initiative position, but after bishop b7, black still can hold it. In the game, black cared about his pawns instead. That's why he played queen c6 and after f3 a6. This keeps all the black's pawns but leaves white his powerful bishop. This is a decisive mistake. The bishop could take vengeance on black after bishop takes g7 here. It gives white a crushing attack after king takes g7 and queen h6. Probably the king will be mated soon. In the game, white overlooked these tactics and he played queen g5. Of course, bishop g7 was much more powerful, but queen g5 move is also logical. You should play on that part of the board where your bishop looks. Black played rook b7, queen h5, attacking the h-zone, g6 and queen g5. Now you can see why an attack is so strong in positions with an opposite color bishops. In fact, white has an extra piece into the attack because black has nothing to oppose against the white's bishop. By the way, even if black's a8 bishop was closer to his king, somewhere on f7 let's say, it wouldn't change anything. White attacks the dark squares, so black's light squared bishop can't help at all. Rook f8 was played, queen e3. White is going to play queen e5 or queen d4, queen b6, bishop d4 and queen b5. Black covered the e5 square, but it doesn't help. Queen takes e6, rook f7. Although black consolidated almost all his pieces for defense, white still has an extra piece into the attack. Now queen g6 leads to a nice mate. After h takes and rook h8. White won this game pretty easily. Let's take a look at the starting position again. Why everything was so sad for black? Because his a8 bishop was passive and he had no possibility to restrict the white's bishop. If black had his f-pawn on f7 or f6, his position would be fine. He would be able to set a pawn chain against the white's bishop by playing f6 and e5. Maybe he could make his extra pawn count. Perhaps black is even better in this case. You can see the great importance of a pawn structure in positions with opposite colored bishops. If a pawn is on f6, black has little advantage. If pawn is on f5, white is almost winning. An activity of opposite colored bishops is the key factor in such positions. This activity is determined by a pawn structure. Okay, this is the whole theory about opposite colored bishops. I hope that everything is clear for you now. Let's move to the next topic, which is two bishops. We already analyzed general properties of a bishop. Also, we discussed the bishop against knight situation. That's why you will easily understand positions with two bishops against a bishop and knight. Actually, all the rules are still the same here. First, two bishops give you an advantage. This advantage is mainly determined by a bishop without a counterpart. As we know, a bishop is stronger than a knight. The main bishop's drawback is that it can't control squares of one color. When you have two bishops, this disadvantage disappears. Two bishops supplement each other very well. They have good harmony. This is another reason why two bishops are so strong. A bishop and a knight can hamper each other sometimes. For instance, in this typical situation, if white develops his knight on the most active square f3, it will close the bishop's diagonal. Two bishops never have such problems. They cannot hamper each other at all. They work harmoniously. Two bishops together can control almost the whole board. This makes them very powerful. Their activity here is close to the queen's power. In this position, black used an interesting positional sacrifice. Rook takes c4, and then after these following forcing moves and bishop takes c4, black has only two bishops against the queen. However, black's bishop pair stands against the queen confidently. Now if white plays queen e4, which is the only available move forward, black replies bishop c3, and on the next move, doesn't matter where white goes, black replies bishop d5. Bishops cover all the squares and the queen has to go back. After queen d3 and bishop e5, black is threatening rook c3, which forces the queen to retreat again. Of course, I'm not saying that black has an advantage here, but he has enough compensation. This game was ended as draw afterwards. Previously, we already discussed some rules about positions with one bishop. Of course, they are applicable for positions with two bishops as well. Bishops need open diagonals, thus you should move pawns and open a position. Bishops can play on both flanks simultaneously, and you should use it. A bishop without a counterpart is more powerful because your opponent has nothing to oppose. Therefore, if you have two bishops, you should mainly use the power of the bishop without a counterpart. You should play on that part of the board where your bishop points to. You see, all the rules are still the same. Black has two bishops, and therefore he needs to open a position. For this purpose, we should move pawns and trade them. That's why black played f5. E takes, rook takes f5. We need to play on that part of the board where your bishops look. Thus black will attack on the queen side. White played knight d4, knight b5, sorry, threatening knight d4. Rook d5, queen f3, queen d7. Now black is going to play rook c8 and rook c2 then. White tried to prevent it by playing rook c1. However, it loses a pawn after rook f5, and then bishop takes b3. Black got a material advantage and white resigned soon. If you have two bishops, you should mainly use the power of a bishop without a counterpart. The black's plan here is to use his light-squared bishop and to attack on the king side, where the b7 bishop looks. He played queen c6, preparing d4, knight d2, castling, and rook e1. Generally, black wants to play d4. However, white will reply knight c to e4, and the knight will close the bishop's diagonal. Black decided to play f5 first to eliminate this white's possibility. That's why he played rook e8 and then f5. Now black is ready to push d4. Taking on f6 would open position for black's bishops. White played b3. Now black starts a crushing attack on the king side using the power of his b7 bishop. He played g5, then d4, then f4. These are all the forcing moves, and after bishop h4, knight takes e5. White certainly can't take the knight because of queen g2 mate. For lack of light-squared bishop, white can't resist the black's pressure on the long diagonal. After any move, black will push f3, opening the long diagonal completely. Now queen takes e5, loses after f2 check, and then queen takes g2 mate. The whole black's attack was based on the power of his bishop without a counterpart. As you already know, a bishop's power rises in an endgame. So if you have two bishops, it's very advantageous to transfer a game into an endgame. Two bishops can give you enough advantage for a win, even without any other positional advantages. The position is totally symmetric. Many players would probably agree to a draw here. However, everything is not that simple. Black has two bishops, which gives him a serious advantage in an endgame. Let's look at the game's continuation. Now it's black's turn. By the way, he can't take on the b2 really, because white will play rook b1 and will take back the b7 pawn after that. That's why in the game black simply played rook d8, c3, rook f8, and b3 and b6. Black is going to play c5, which will restrict the white's bishop and knight. In an endgame, two bishops control lots of squares, and this gives you a possibility to advance your pawns. Your opponent can't do the same, otherwise his advanced pawns will be attacked by two bishops. For example, in the current position, black can play c5, c4, a5, a4, and whatever he wants. Unlike black, white cannot do anything. White can't move the c-pawn, because black will capture the pawn on the b2. The b2 pawn can't go forward because it will weaken the c3 pawn. Even a4 move looks a bit dubious because black will play bishop e6, and then bishop c4 and will attack white's weaknesses. It's important to remember this idea. A side with two bishops can and should advance pawns in an endgame. White played h3, bishop e6, rook d1, and c5. The white's position is already a bit cramped. His pieces haven't any good squares to go to. An attempt to bring the king into the center will make the king vulnerable and will give black an extra attacking possibilities. In the game, bishop g5 was played, f6, bishop f4, and king f7. Black has no problems with activating his king. This is another aspect I'd like you to pay attention on. Two bishops give you domination. This allows you to centralize your king, which is very important in an endgame. f3, g5, black keeps advancing the pawns. Bishop e3, h6. One of the ways to restrict opponent's bishop is to place your pawns on the color of that bishop. We discussed it in the previous lesson. Here, black creates pawn chains on the dark squares in order to constrict the white's bishop. There followed rook e1, f5, white played f4, otherwise black would play f4 by himself. Now bishop f6, g3, a5, the black's plan is still the same, he pushes the pawns forward. Now he is threatening to break white's pawns after a3, so white has to play a3, bishop c4, the bishop cuts off the knight and other white's pieces. King f2 was played. Black improved his position on both flanks and got domination. Now it's time to make invasion and to start a direct attack. However, the white's pieces control all the squares under his territory. That's why black decided to exchange one of the white's defenders. He played g takes f4 and bishop g5. After trading the white's bishop, black will be able to go inside with rook d2. There is a well-known dictum: a good thing about two bishops is that you can always trade one of them. I agree with that, but I think it's not precise enough. I would say, if you have two bishops, you can trade an opponent's important defender on one of your bishops when necessary. In the game there followed bishop takes, king e3, trying to cover the d2 square, king f6, h4, and here black has a forcing win. After the exchange, black goes king e5, after that he will capture the h-pawn, and white simply has nothing to do. White resigned soon. Let's make some conclusions about two bishops in an endgame. First, two bishops give you serious advantage in an endgame. With the support of your bishops, you can and should advance your pawns, centralize your king, attack opponent's pawns on both flanks. Also, you can trade an opponent's important defender on one of your bishops when necessary. Okay, so far we analyzed how to play with two bishops. Sometimes, however, you have to play against them. Of course, the ways to restrict bishop's activity are still the same. At the same time, I'd like to make an important note. Usually, it's impossible to restrain both the opponent's bishops. Therefore, it makes sense to play against one certain bishop. A bishop without a counterpart is the most dangerous for you. That's why you should mainly limit an activity of this bishop. White has little more initiative position thanks to his two bishops. How can black neutralize the white's pressure? First, we need to notice that white has two bishops and the d4 bishop has no counterpart. It pressures black's king side and the b6 weakness. Therefore, black should limit an activity of that d4 bishop. Generally, there are four ways how this can be done. In this position, only one method is possible: to create a pawn chain on the color of the bishop. Black played knight e8, preparing f6 and e5. There followed rook b1, rook d6, f3, f6, and e5. Almost all the black's pawns are on the dark squares and the bishop's mobility is limited greatly. Now if white goes bishop c3 or bishop b2, black can attack it with knight a4. The move bishop a1 is too passive and allows black to pressure on the d-file by playing rook d8. In any case, the white's dark squared bishop became very passive. Black equalized the game and has a comfortable position. That's about everything you need to know about two bishops. I hope that everything was clear to you. Actually, we already analyzed most of these rules while talking about one bishop. Let's call it a day for now and get ready for the next lessons.